This is LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:50. It's 100 years to the day since the first Labour government in British history was formed. Under Ramsay MacDonald, this minority government took power in 1924 in very different circumstances, really tough times in the aftermath of World War I and widespread fear in the country about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In his very engaging book about that government, Wild Men, the author David Torrance tells the story of this remarkable collection of working-class politicians and their posh allies who ran the country without disaster for a mere 9 months. Nobody really seems to want to remember the story of the first Labour government. Keir Starmer's party is doing, so far as I can tell, absolutely nothing to mark or celebrate the centenary. But there is really nothing to be embarrassed about here, and I put it to Mr. Torrance that in actual fact its members were anything but wild men.
This was a sort of smear campaign, if you like, at the time from the Daily Mail, from their Conservative opponents. And it was all designed to make a connection in voters' minds between what they saw as the wild men of the British Labour Party and, of course, the Bolshevist revolutionaries of Russia from a few years before.
The genuine wild men. And there are big differences then and now, of course, many of them, but also some really interesting similarities. So this was a Labour Party in a time when the Northern Irish border and Scotland were both very big issues?
Yeah, what academics would call the territorial constitution is in flux. Most of Ireland has just left the UK. Devolution has been granted to Northern Ireland. But the border between the two parts of Ireland is unsettled. And there's a real impasse. The Ulster Unionist government in Belfast is refusing to play ball with Dublin and London. And it falls to MacDonald and his colleagues to get that moving, which indeed they do. That's one of, I think, the many successes of that short government.
So in 1924, the Liberals have, as it were, let them have a go at being in government, but it's a very different group of people in cabinet socially than we have ever seen before in Britain, and the King is among those who is really concerned about what's going to happen.
Yeah, the King is not a natural socialist, I think it's fair to say. But the cabinet itself is actually a real mix. About a third are genuinely working class. I think the most working class cabinet we've probably ever had. Sons of miners, trade unionists. Ramsay MacDonald himself is an illegitimate son of a farmhand. There's also some aristocratic liberals who have moved to the Labour Party, and even some Conservatives. Lord Chelmsford, the impeccably aristocratic First Lord of the Admiralty, tells everyone on his appointment, "I've been a Conservative all my life."
And so one of the interesting things that happens early on is as Britain starts to come to terms with the idea of this kind of Labour government, clothes become an incredibly important social issue.
Indeed. So the first thing the new ministers have to do is take their seals of office from the King at a meeting of the Privy Council. This has a strict dress code: top hats, tails, knee breeches at court, all the rest of it. For the working class members of the cabinet, they simply don't own the requisite clothes. They can't afford to buy them. And so you end up with this real mishmash of outfits on display. But it becomes more broadly emblematic of a split within the Labour Party between those who prioritise appearing respectable, that would be MacDonald and senior ministers, and those like John Wheatley who want to get things done and stress the radicalism of the party rather than dressing up.
Again and again in the history of the Labour Party, foreign affairs intervenes. They don't get into power because of foreign affairs, but foreign affairs reshapes what happens to Labour governments. And that is certainly true of the very first Labour government, and really it's foreign affairs that bring them down.
Indeed, although weirdly that was also one of Ramsay MacDonald's main triumphs. He's Foreign Secretary as well as Prime Minister. He basically revises the Versailles Treaty. Germany's being crippled by reparations to France. He makes a triumphant speech at the League of Nations. But yes, it's also the fear of the Red Menace. Russian disinformation is nothing new. You have basically an early example of fake news, the Zinoviev letter, which blows apart the October 1924 government. Also the Campbell case, the botched prosecution of a communist journalist. All of this is used by Conservatives and the press to again make that link in voters' minds between Russian revolutionaries and the wild men, as they see it, of the British Labour Party.
And after 9 months or so, they're brought down in another general election. So the Northern Ireland border an issue, Scotland a border, Russia an issue. It seems very familiar in lots of ways. What do you think is the lesson that Keir Starmer ought to take from the very first Labour government?
I can't really get into contemporary politics, but I think the history of that moment, the events of 1924, are hugely important for the Labour Party. Clement Attlee put it best, looking back from 1937. He'd become very critical of MacDonald. He'd been a junior minister in that government. But even he saw what he called the utility of just entering office. Voters, he said, don't believe anything they can't see. They could see Labour in office. They could see they were capable of it. And that set the tone for future Labour governments. Clement Attlee in 1945, Harold Wilson, and of course, Tony Blair much later on.
And I'm quite sure 100 years later, Keir Starmer is hoping me too. David Torrance, thank you very much indeed.